It started on a cold Wednesday morning, the kind that wrapped you in gray light and made coffee taste stronger. Jim sat by the window, staring at the snow-covered porch, his breath fogging the glass. The silence in the house was louder than anything. It had been 2 days since he walked out on Vivian. 2 days since the truth poured out like spilled whiskey over a fine dinner. Gone to hell. Vivian had always been composed, grace and heels, a voice soft like candlelight, eyes that could either warm or wound. Jim fell for her before he even knew her last name. But what he didn't know, what he wasn't supposed to know, was that behind the charm, the tailored smiles, and the wine-sipping laughter, she kept secrets deep enough to drown a man. The night he found out about Alejandro was the night something inside him split. Alejandro wasn't just some name in a phone or a shadow in the background. He was real, a presence, a threat dressed in polished suits and warm cologne, who had once shaken Jim's hand like a brother. The betrayal wasn't only about the affair. It was about being made small, made a fool, in his own life. Vivian never cried when Jim confronted her. She simply looked at him, tired and unapologetic. Her silence said more than words ever could. That was what stung the most, how casual it all felt to her. But it wasn't just Vivian. Glenna, her closest friend and Jim's once confidant, had known. She'd smiled through dinners, sent holiday cards, gave hugs full of nothing. She was part of it, maybe not physically, but emotionally complicit in that silent, laughing way. And when he left the house, he didn't slam the door. He didn't yell. He simply packed a bag and left a note. I won't fight anymore. Not for lies. I'm leaving you all with your truths. Please don't look for me. Jim now, 2 days later, he found himself in a small cabin upstate that smelled like old pine and peace. The heater coughed to life in the corner. Jim sat, hands curled around a mug, not sure if he felt free or just forgotten. But something was waking up in him, something he hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not revenge, clarity. He hadn't told anyone where he was going, not even his brother, not his boss. He just vanished, letting the world believe what it wanted. Maybe they'd say he lost it. Maybe Vivian would cry to her mother and say she never saw it coming. Maybe Glenna would shrug and say he wasn't strong enough for her anyway. Maybe Alejandro would raise his glass and say, well, now she's mine. None of it mattered anymore. He had no plan, no future lined up, just the clean slate of isolation. Every morning, he woke with no expectations, and every night he slept with no regrets. But then something strange started happening. He began writing. Not poems, not letters, just truths. On old paper, with a pen that scratched too much, he wrote memories that had never been spoken. He wrote about the first time he saw Vivian laugh, about the way Alejandro looked at her when he thought no one noticed, about Glenna's fake concern that masked quiet judgment. He wasn't writing for revenge. He was writing for clarity. And in doing so, he started to rebuild something himself. Then one morning, after a week of snow and silence, a knock came at the door. A slow, heavy knock. Jim stared at it. No one should know he was here. When he opened it, a letter was lying on the step, wrapped in plastic. No name, just his address scribbled in sharp strokes. He looked around. No footprints, no car sounds. He brought it in, heart tight in his chest, hands unsure. He opened it and read one line that knocked the wind out of him. You're not the only one who left a letter. Jim sat down slowly, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. That single line echoed in his head, looping like a cruel joke. He read it again, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less haunting, but they didn't. You're not the only one who left a letter. He scanned the paper. No signature, no return address, just the line, scribbled in a familiar slant that dug somewhere deep in his memory. It was Vivian's handwriting. His chest tightened. For a long while, he just sat there, staring at the fire that cracked quietly in the stone hearth. He didn't want to feel what was coming, not curiosity, not worry, not even guilt. But it came anyway, like cold creeping through a cracked window. What letter? Where? When? Did she leave too? He grabbed his coat, stuffed the letter into his pocket, and stepped outside. The air was sharp and bitter, snow crunching under his boots. The silence here had once comforted him. Now it pressed down on his skin like weight. He needed answers. He didn't want them, but he needed them. By noon, Jim was back on the road. The long drive back into the city felt like peeling back a wound that had barely scabbed. He passed familiar road signs, gas stations they used to stop at together, diners they laughed in, like everything was going to last forever. The closer he got, the heavier his heart grew. When he finally reached the apartment, the building looked the same. Nothing ever changes fast in this part of town, but the second he stepped into the hallway, he felt it something off. Something gone. He unlocked the door. The place was empty. Not half empty, like someone just moved out. Empty, like no one ever lived there. Walls bare, closets open, dust where picture frames used to be, and on the kitchen counter, a plain white envelope with his name. He reached for it like it might burn him. Inside was a longer letter. This one definitely hers. She hadn't tried to soften the truth or sugarcoat the damage. Vivian never did. She'd always been brutal in her own graceful way. Jim, I didn't expect you to come back. I didn't even expect you to read this. But if you're reading, that means you still care enough to hurt. I won't ask for forgiveness. I won't insult you like that. What I did with Alejandro, it happened because I let it, not because you were lacking. I think I broke something in us long before the cheating. I don't know when, maybe during those silent dinners, or the nights you worked late and didn't ask why I stayed out. Glenna knew. Of course she knew. She's not innocent, but she was always better at pretending everything was fine. I couldn't. I left because I didn't want to keep watching us rot in the same house. I left a letter for you, because I know how it feels to vanish without a goodbye. You once told me peace looked like solitude and a view of trees. I hope you find that place again. I hope you forgive yourself, if not me. Vivian. Jim stood there, letter hanging from his fingers, the silence around him thick and sharp. She hadn't just left the relationship, she'd left everything. Vivian was gone. But the strange part was, it didn't feel like defeat. It felt like release. And still, the ache of unfinished things lingered. He didn't know where she'd gone, but something told him she didn't want to be found. Not yet. Maybe not ever. As he stood in the middle of that ghost apartment, a soft knock tapped on the door again. Not a loud one. Just enough. Jim turned, walked over, and opened it. Glenna stood there, coat tight, lips red, eyes unreadable. Hi, she said softly. Jim blinked, unsure if this was real or some final test from the universe. I brought something, she said, holding up a small box. It's yours. She wanted you to have it. Jim didn't move right away. He just stared at the box in Glenna's hands, his mind racing in loops it couldn't complete. She stood there patiently, eyes low, as if even she wasn't sure why she came or what this was supposed to fix. Finally, he stepped aside. She walked in without a word, and placed the box on the coffee table, one of the only pieces of furniture left in the room. It looked old, like it had traveled through time, edges frayed, hinges dulled. He didn't reach for it. Instead, he looked at her, really looked at her. Her face was tired. There was a slight quiver in her jaw, like someone trying hard not to break in front of someone they'd already betrayed once. I didn't come to explain, she said, sitting on the edge of the couch. I know it won't matter. I owed it to you. She asked me to give this to you if you came back. Jim stayed standing. Why you? Because she didn't trust herself to see you again, Glenna replied, voice hollow. Said if she saw you, she'd forget why she left. That cut deep. And it didn't help that it came from the one person who had kept his pain wrapped up like some party favor, smiling through it all while watching everything burn behind his back. You knew, he said. She nodded. No excuses, no backtracking, just the truth. I didn't stop her, she added. And that's something I have to carry. Jim swallowed hard. You both made me feel insane. I know, Glenna whispered. We gaslit you, made you second guess every instinct. I replay it all the time. The nights you asked where she was, the moments I shrugged and told you not to be so suspicious. God, I wish I could undo it. He finally sat across from her, the air between them filled with everything that should have been said long ago. What's in the box? He asked. Glenna hesitated. Pieces, little things, things she couldn't keep, but couldn't throw away. Jim opened it. Inside were old photos, ones he hadn't seen in years. Smiles that once felt real. A pressed flower from their honeymoon hike. A necklace she wore the night he proposed. But beneath it all, tucked in a corner, was something that made his hands freeze. A sonogram. He looked up sharply, his breath catching in his throat. Glenna looked away. She didn't tell you because she didn't want to use it as a reason to stay. When? He asked. voice strained. About 5 months ago, she replied quietly. She found out a week before you left. Jim leaned back, the room spinning slightly. It wasn't just a breakup. It wasn't just betrayal. There had been life between them. A future neither of them got to hold. She said she knew it was too broken to fix. Glenna added that if she stayed, it would have been out of guilt, not love. And she didn't want the baby to grow up in that kind of home. It felt like getting hit all over again, but this time there was no anger, just a quiet, bone-deep sorrow. I need to find her, he said. Glenna shook her head. She doesn't want to be found. She left no trail, Jim. Trust me, I asked. Then why? Tell me now. Because you deserve to know. And maybe so, you wouldn't spend the rest of your life blaming her without knowing what she gave up to. Jim stared at the box again, hands resting on the edge like it might vanish. After a long silence, Glenna stood. I should go. She paused. At the door. For what it's worth, she said, eyes soft but distant. You were always better than we deserved. Then she left, the door closing with a gentle finality. Jim sat alone again, but this time with more than silence. Now he had questions. Now he had a child somewhere out there and a woman he might still love, even if he didn't want to. And as the snow started falling again outside, covering the city like a soft burial, Jim knew he couldn't just sit still anymore. The night was long, the kind of night that didn't ask for sleep, just endurance. Jim sat by the window, the box open beside him, the sonogram photo held gently in his hands like it was glass. He stared at the shape inside it, the curve of a life not yet real, not yet named. That tiny figure pulled at something primal in him. Fear, love, guilt, all of it. Vivian had walked away, and she'd taken more than herself. She'd taken a piece of him he didn't even know existed until it was already gone. The next morning, he packed again, not with the numb detachment of last time, but with intention. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but he couldn't stay frozen. Not when part of him was out there, breathing through someone else's choices. He called in a favor from a friend, someone who owed him from his old consulting days. The kind of guy who knew how to track people, off the books, no paper trail. Jim didn't ask for details. He just gave the name, a photo, and a quiet plea. Find her. The wait was brutal. Days passed. Snow melted into slush. He stayed in motels, kept moving, not wanting to return to the cabin yet. Not yet. That place had become sacred, a kind of rebirth, and he wasn't ready to defile it with this storm of uncertainty. Then the call came. I found her. Jim's heart thumped in his chest like a war drum. The voice on the other end gave him a town name, a rental cabin on a coastal stretch hours away. Quiet, secluded. She'd paid in cash, registered under her mother's maiden name. She didn't want to be found, but she hadn't disappeared entirely. Jim didn't hesitate. He drove. Through the night, the road long and wet, headlights slicing through mist. His mind didn't rest once. What would he say? Would she slam the door? Would she even open it? By the time he reached the coast, the sun was rising, bleeding orange into the sky like hope trying to break through. He parked, stepped out, and stared at the cabin, tucked between wild trees and foggy cliffs. It looked like her, serene, distant, hard to reach. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again, softer this time. Footsteps. The door opened slowly, and there she was, Vivian. Her hair was longer, her face tired, her eyes wide with shock. She stood barefoot, wrapped in a cardigan, a steaming mug in her hand, like she'd just woken up from a dream she never planned to leave. For a long moment, neither of them said a word. Then she spoke, voice barely a whisper. How did you find me? Jim stepped forward but didn't cross the threshold. You left me with pieces. I couldn't stop until I understood what they meant. Her jaw clenched. I asked Glenna not to. She didn't tell me where you were. Jim cut in. She gave me the box. That was enough. Vivian looked down, then back at him. I didn't want to hurt you again. Too late for that, he said softly. But I'm not here to throw blame around. I needed to see you. I needed to know. Silence again. Then with hesitant fingers, she pushed the door open wider. Just enough. He stepped in. The cabin was warm, lived in, smelled like coffee and lavender. There were books everywhere, a small crib in the corner of the living room, and in that crib, a tiny body moved beneath a blanket. Jim's breath hitched. She's 4 weeks old, Vivian said quietly. Her name's Isla. He walked over like the floor might break beneath him, looked down. A baby, pink-skinned, fragile, sleeping, with the kind of peace only the innocent ever have. His daughter, our daughter, he whispered. Vivian stood beside him, unsure, guarded. You have every right to be angry. I'm not, Jim said, eyes still on Isla. I'm just here. Vivian looked at him, and for the first time, the walls in her eyes cracked a little. I didn't think you'd want this, she said. I didn't know I needed it, he replied, and in that moment, neither forgiveness nor reconciliation mattered. Only the tiny breath of a child and the unspoken possibility that maybe, just maybe, this broken thing between them could become something new. The morning passed in quiet breaths and cautious glances. Jim sat on the couch, Isla curled in the crook of his arm, her tiny hand resting on his chest like she already knew him. Vivian watched from the kitchen, unsure if she was witnessing a beginning or a repeat of a cycle that had already broken them once. Jim had always been gentle, even in anger. It was something Vivian used to love, his calm, his patience. But now, that calm unsettled her. It meant he had thought this through. It meant he wasn't here to scream or accuse. He was here because he meant it, and that was terrifying. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you, she said after a while, voice low. I left because I couldn't live with what I did, and pretend like it didn't matter. Jim didn't look at her. He just kept watching Isla breathe. I know, he said. Vivian blinked. She hadn't expected that. No dramatic questions. No why did you? Or how could you? Just that simple acceptance. He knew. Somehow even in his pain he understood. I never wanted you to find out like that, she said. He finally turned to her. You mean the betrayal or the baby? Vivian's face twisted slightly, guilt creeping in like a shadow. Both? Jim nodded slowly. You should have told me, no matter how messy it was going to be. She came closer, sat down across from him. I didn't want to use the pregnancy to fix us. That would have been selfish. But you kept the baby, he said. Even though you knew you were leaving, I kept her because she's innocent. Because for once, I wanted to choose something that wasn't about running or pretending. Jim looked down at Isla. She looks like you. Vivian smiled faintly. Except the mouth. That's all you. They sat in silence again. Not cold silence. Not angry. Just two people who had said too little for too long, finally letting the space fill with the truth of what was left. Are you with him? Jim asked eventually, his voice more curious than bitter. Vivian shook her head. Alejandro's gone. It ended before I even knew I was pregnant. It was never going to be. More than it was a mistake. That word hung in the air. Mistake, Jim repeated softly. Was I a mistake too? Vivian's eyes snapped to his. No, God, no, you were the best thing in my life. But I stopped being the kind of person who deserved you. Jim exhaled, a long, tired sound. Maybe we both stopped being who we were. She reached for Isla, gently lifting her from Jim's arms. The baby stirred but didn't wake, snuggling into her mother's chest like she knew she was safe. I'm not asking for anything, Jim said. Not a second chance. Not a place in your life. I want to be in hers. Vivian looked at him, her eyes glassy. You really mean that? He nodded. She didn't ask for any of this. And she deserves the truth, not just the good parts. Vivian studied him for a moment. Then stay, a few days, see what this feels like. Jim didn't answer right away, but something shifted in his expression. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was the slow return of trust. I'll stay, he said finally. For her, and for us if there's still anything left to find. Vivian didn't cry. She wasn't that kind of woman, but her breath hitched in her throat, and she reached for his hand, just once, just long enough. Outside, the waves crashed against the cliffs, relentless and steady, just like them, weathered, wounded, but still here. The next few days passed like a strange dream, one that hummed quietly with the ghosts of what once was, but also flickered with the possibility of something new. Jim didn't try to force anything. He didn't ask Vivian about the past beyond what she was willing to say, and she didn't press him about the future. They just existed together, but differently. He learned Isla's cries, how they changed depending on whether she was hungry, tired, or just needed to feel someone's skin. He learned that Vivian hummed the same lullaby each night, something her grandmother used to sing, soft and almost haunting. And he learned how much peace could be found in just holding something so small and yet so full of meaning. Vivian watched him carefully. Jim had always been good with people, but this was different. She saw the way he stared at Isla, like he was trying to memorize every eyelash, every breath. She saw the way he held her, like he might break if she slipped away. And she saw the man she'd once believed would be the father of her children even when she'd stopped believing in herself. It was the third night when something shifted. Between them, they were on the porch after Isla had gone down, wrapped in separate blankets, staring out into the black ocean. The wind was cold, but neither of them wanted to go back inside yet. Too much unsaid still lived in the silence between them. She almost didn't make it, Vivian said, her voice just above a whisper. Jim turned to her slowly. Vivian's eyes were on the dark horizon. The birth. It got complicated. I lost too much blood. They told me if I'd waited another hour. Jim didn't move, didn't breathe. I was alone, she continued. No family, no friends. I didn't tell anyone. I thought I deserved to suffer. That it was the price I had to pay. Jim's hands clenched on his blanket. You could have died. She looked at him then. I know. And you would have left me with nothing. Not even the truth. I didn't expect to survive, she said. I didn't expect to ever see you again. Jim shook his head slowly. I would have wanted to be there, Vivian. Even after everything. She turned her face away, but not fast enough for him to miss the tear slipping down her cheek. No, she said. He reached for her hand, not sure if she'd pull away, but she didn't. Her fingers curled into his, hesitant but warm. This isn't easy, she whispered. You being here, me, still loving you in pieces. Jim swallowed hard. I'm not here for easy. I'm here because we have a daughter. And because I never stopped loving you, even when I hated what you did. She blinked hard, another tear falling. Can you really forgive me? She asked. Jim looked at her, his voice low and certain. No, not completely, not yet, but I can try. And if I'm here in a year, or 10, maybe that means I did. Vivian leaned her head on his shoulder. They didn't speak after that. Words had done enough damage. Now they needed time, space, presence. Later that night, they both checked on Isla together. She was dreaming, fingers twitching, lips parting slightly, like she was whispering secrets to the stars. And in that moment, the three of them damaged, unsure, barely stitched together, felt like a family. Not perfect, not healed, but still here. The days blended into each other like brush strokes on a painting. They weren't sure how to finish. Mornings started with Isla's soft coos and the smell of coffee, followed by shared silences and small smiles between Jim and Vivian that felt more real than any I love you ever had. Back when things were easy and fake, Jim stayed longer than a few days. He didn't say it aloud, but every morning he woke up in the small guest room. He looked at the folded clothes on the chair and knew he wasn't ready to leave. And Vivian didn't ask him to. Maybe because she couldn't. Maybe because some small piece of her was hoping he never would. They took turns feeding Isla, changing her, walking her around the living room while whispering nonsense, just to keep her calm. It became their rhythm, no labels, no big talks, just this fragile understanding that they were rebuilding something from the wreckage. But peace never comes without its shadows. On the 8th day, a knock came at the door, loud, sharp, impatient. Jim was rocking Isla while Vivian folded laundry on the couch. They froze. No one knew they were here. Vivian slowly stepped to the door, peered through the side window. Then she stiffened. Jim stood, the baby still in his arms. Who is it? She opened the door just enough to speak. Her voice was low, flat. Alejandro. Jim didn't move. Alejandro stood there, perfectly dressed like always, a coat that looked like it cost more than Jim's entire outfit, and that same infuriating calm in his eyes. But this time, there was something else, panic, maybe, desperation. I just want to talk, he said. You shouldn't be here, Vivian replied. Jim stepped into the doorway then, Isla resting against his shoulder. Alejandro blinked. His gaze dropped to the child, then back up to Jim's face. Oh, he said. So it's like that. Jim's voice was steady. It's always been like this. You were the mistake. Alejandro laughed bitterly. Vivian didn't think I was a mistake. When she was in my bed, Vivian's voice sliced the air. Enough. Alejandro looked at her, something in his face collapsing. I came because I thought maybe you didn't really choose him. That maybe you were scared. That you needed space but not this. Vivian stepped forward. I didn't choose Jim. I chose the truth. I chose my daughter. And this. She motioned to the door between them. This ends here. Alejandro stared at her, all his expensive charm falling off him like dead skin. For a moment, Jim saw him clearly, not the man he'd envied or hated, but a hollow thing trying to hold on to something he never earned. Goodbye, Alejandro, Vivian said. He didn't argue. He just looked once more at the baby in Jim's arms, then walked away slowly, vanishing into the cold morning air like a ghost who finally realized he was dead. Vivian shut the door and leaned against it, her breath shaking. Jim walked over, handed Isla to her gently. Are you okay? He asked. She nodded, but her hands trembled as she held the baby close. I am now. Jim stepped closer. He's not coming back. Vivian met his eyes, something fierce behind hers. Even if he does, I won't open the door again. Later that night, when the house was quiet and Isla slept between them on the couch, Jim touched Vivian's hand. She didn't pull away. She turned to him and whispered, I don't want to keep waiting for the past to catch up with us. Jim brushed his thumb across her knuckles. Then maybe it's time we start deciding what our future looks like. Vivian didn't answer right away, but the way she looked at him said enough. Maybe they would never be perfect, but maybe they'd be real this time. The wind outside whispered against the windows, but inside, the warmth of something almost whole spread between them. Vivian leaned her head against Jim's shoulder, her fingers gently tracing Isla's back, while he rested his hand on her knee, grounding her in a way neither of them had felt in years. The past no longer hovered between them like a thread. It lingered, yes, but less like a ghost and more like a scar, a mark of survival, of what they had done to each other, and what they had chosen to rise from. A few days turned into a week stretched into 2. Jim didn't say the words I'm staying, but the suitcase at the guest room door remained unpacked. He helped fix the leaky faucet in the kitchen, rewired the loose porch light, brought groceries from town without being asked. It was subtle, but it was something Vivian felt every time she passed by him, every time she looked at Isla and saw how her father looked at her. Like the world made sense again. And still, not everything was easy. There were days when they snapped at each other over nothing, sleep-deprived and on edge. Times when Vivian drifted into herself, guilt clinging like smoke to her expression. Jim caught her staring sometimes, eyes lost in something he couldn't touch. And sometimes Jim went too quiet, carrying his pain in silence rather than risk breaking the fragile peace. But they didn't walk away this time. They stayed. They talked. One rainy night, after Isla had finally settled and the storm outside rattled the walls, Jim found Vivian on the porch again, just like the night Alejandro had shown up. She was barefoot, wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea with her legs tucked under her. He stepped beside her, didn't ask to sit, just did. I think I'm afraid, she said, her eyes following the drops as they slid down the railing. Not of you, not of us, but of messing this up again, of hurting you again. Jim didn't speak right away. Then quietly he said, then let's promise each other one thing. She looked at him. No more running from anything, not from pain, not from truth, not from each other. Vivian nodded slowly. Okay, and that was it. No grand declarations, no cinematic kisses, just that quiet, shared vow between two people who'd once burned everything to the ground and were now planting something in its ashes. Weeks later, they brought Isla into town for her first checkup. The doctor smiled at the baby's healthy weight, her strong grip, her steady heartbeat. On the way home, they stopped for coffee, and people asked about the baby like she was just any child, born to just any couple. And for once, that felt like a gift. Jim got a small job in the town doing freelance work online, spending mornings with Isla, while Vivian slowly took on remote consulting work again. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, raw, real. One morning, while Isla napped and sunlight poured into the cabin in gold slants, Vivian placed a letter on the kitchen table. Jim picked it up, brow furrowed. What's this? She smiled. My turn. He opened it. Inside was a single line. You were never just the end. You were the reason I began again. He looked up at her, and for the first time in years, she saw tears in his eyes that weren't from hurt but from healing. Vivian walked to him, wrapped her arms around his waist, and for the first time since everything fell apart, they held each other like they meant it. Like the storm had passed. Jim pressed a kiss into her hair. Then let's keep beginning. Over and over, as many times as it takes. And so, in the quiet of that reborn life, no crowds, no noise, no revenge, just love earned the hard way. They stayed, together. Isla stirred in the other room, soft and alive, a perfect sound, and outside, the sea no longer sounded like lost. It sounded like peace.